Sudan is suffering the world's worst famine in 4 decades, says the United Nations, as conflict between government and paramilitary forces rages. Yet international aid, never needed more than now, is dwindling. What's next for the people of Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, while the world often seems to be looking elsewhere, the worst humanitarian crisis anywhere is deepening in Sudan. More than 2 years of conflict brings its own misery, but add to that famine and the horror is barely imaginable. A famine the United Nations and others warn, which is the world's worst in 40 years. The fighting between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces has forced nearly 13 million people from their homes, just under a quarter of the population. Yet despite all this, international aid is falling. Humanitarian organisations, often working in dangerous areas, say the situation is catastrophic. So why is this happening? And what's next if things don't change for the people of Sudan? Will the world respond to avert further disaster? We'll discuss all of this and more with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Mohammed Haji.
Increasingly catastrophic, the words of UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on the situation in Sudan, frequently described as the world's worst humanitarian and worst displacement crises. Since the army pushed the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, out of Khartoum in March, the paramilitary group has concentrated its attacks on North Darfur. Its days-long assault on the Zamzam refugee camp forced hundreds of thousands of already displaced people to flee yet again. The UN says at least 300 civilians were killed when RSF fighters stormed what they said was an army base. Throughout the conflict, the paramilitary group has been accused of systematically targeting particular ethnic groups. Those who survived the takeover of Zamzam sought refuge in Tawila, a town in North Darfur.
More than 400,000 people have fled from Zamzam camp in recent days. Many have arrived in Tawila, where a WFP convoy of trucks has also arrived with food to assist more than 200,000 people. There are more trucks en route, including to El Fasher itself.
Both the army and the RSF are accused of using starvation as a weapon of war, as Sudan slips further into famine.
We send our children to chase after the trucks distributing food, just so we can have something to eat. We don't have access to clean water or basic sleeping materials like mats or mattresses. They stole 7 of our donkeys. We're in a dire situation, especially the children.
And charities say aid workers have been targeted.
We lost our staff due to such attacks, and some of them were in Darfur, while others were in the Blue Nile. So what we need right now is that we need to guarantee the safety of humanitarian and aid workers, as well as guaranteeing safe passages to deliver food to those who need it the most. People are dying of hunger.
More than 2 years on, violence between the army and paramilitary rapid support forces shows no sign of abating. And it's Sudan's civilians who are paying the ultimate price. Mohammed Haji, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Cairo is Amgad Fareid Eltayeb, Executive Director of Fikra for Studies and Development, a Sudanese research and policy organisation. Over in New York, we have Kholood, Khair, who's the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think tank formerly based in Khartoum. And in Nairobi in Kenya is Justin Lynch, who is the managing director of Conflict Insights Group and also the co-author of the book Sudan's Unfinished Democracy. All well positioned to talk about this. Welcome to you all. Kholood, I'd like to start with you, if I may, to give us more about the human picture. This situation is truly horrifying, isn't it? In your experience, how does it compare with what's gone before in Sudan?
Well, you often hear from people on the ground that this is the worst they've ever faced. You have to remember that in Sudan and in Darfur in particular, there are people who have been displaced for 20 years. There are people who have been, facing conflict for 20 plus years. And there are those who have grown up in IDP camps, those who've grown up without services, those who've grown up with the threat and violence hanging over their heads. And the refrain you often hear is, this is the worst it's ever been, particularly from the older IDPs and older people. They say that they've never faced this level of hunger. They've never faced this level of sort of desperation in terms of trying to find services for their children, particularly health and education, that infant mortality has rarely been this high. And so though Sudan's history of the last few decades has been one that has been littered with series of conflicts and emergencies, this one seems to very much top them all.
And Amgad, so bad that they say the scale of the famine makes it the largest humanitarian crisis in decades, if not of our time, and it's clearly getting worse by the day.
Yes, actually, the famine that we are witnessing now in Sudan is the worst since the 50s, not only in Sudan, but in the whole of Africa. And it has many reasons that are combinedly producing this. Firstly, the RSF have intentionally destroyed the food production capacity of Sudan, whether the farms, whether the agriculture, the manufacturing, all of that. As well, the international humanitarian aid have not been effective enough because of the lack of funding, because of the lack of readiness, and also because of the bureaucratic obstacles that have been put by the current Sudanese government. And these obstacles are based on a trust deficit that have been growing up for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. That the current authorities do not trust the international community intentions, and there is also a politicization of the humanitarian interventions, like what we see from the United Arab Emirates, for example, using the humanitarian diplomacy in order to launder and whitewash its involvement in supporting the rapid support forces in Sudan.
Well, we'll get into all of that in a second, Amgad, especially the political nature of it. You mentioned the RSF. But I think it's fair to say that both sides, or people say that both sides are getting in the way of this. But we'll discuss that in a minute. I want to bring in Justin next. We'll talk about the funding crisis in just a moment. But is this, at least in part, to blame because aid agencies were slow in responding in the first place and had to play catch up?
To be honest, absolutely not. I remember back in 2020, we knew that this was coming in Darfur. I worked for aid agencies, and I remember warning many government officials like Amgad that there was going to be a crisis in Darfur if peacekeepers did not stay, if action was not taken on behalf of the international community. Those actions were ignored. So it was the NGOs who were on the ground who have been warning about this situation for a long time. What we have right now is a situation where both the SAF and the RSF are blocking humanitarian workers from really trying to prevent and assist people who are facing famine. And I think what's really important to know is that in the next couple of months, we're going to see the rainy season, and humanitarian workers expect that these famine figures will get worse. And so urgent funding and assistance is needed, particularly in Tooele, which you showed in your clip earlier.
Amgad, we're just losing connection with you visually, but we can hear you, so we will carry on. And I'd just like you to respond to Justin's point that authorities were warned by NGOs about the impending situation some time ago, some years ago, and that those warnings were ignored.
Yeah, actually, what Justin's trying to do is to jump over many facts that happened between the time that we were in government, and then there was a government reshuffle after it, and then there was a coup after it, and then the international community tried to engage in a Humpty-Dumpty type of diplomacy that led us to the current war. But it's not about the past. It's not about scoring or settling political points. It's about the reality right now. And I can refer you to the UN SRSG Fairest report to the UN Security Council when he said that we were taken by surprise, like meaning the international community. Although that was not true, there was many warning signs, there was many analysis saying that we are going to war because of the flawed interventions that the international community is doing. But also this is not the problem because it is on the past. The current problem and the current crisis that we're living in is the epistemological bias that some analysts or many analysts to push into this war by assuming that there is political and moral equivalence between the two sides of the war. And on that, I can see it clearly on what Justin say when say both SAF and the RSF. He forgot that SAF is part of the state apparatus that also includes the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Social Welfare, etc., 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 which is a government who's trying to provide to its people.
Amgad, sorry, I'll come back to you shortly, but Kholood, I don't want to get too much into the politics of all this because it'll divert us away from the humanitarian crisis. But just one thought from you about what Amgad has just been saying.
Well, I think, people are leaving RSF areas to go to safer areas, whether that's Chad or other countries or SAF-controlled areas. And this is because they have an understanding right now that SAF is not going to attack them. Of course, this was not the case 20 years ago. And the politics of this is very much fluid, let's say. But Amgad is right in saying that, there are people who feel safer in RSF areas once leaving, in SAF areas once leaving RSF areas. But the Sudanese armed forces, if they are to be the state, as Amgad posits, then we need to hold them to a higher regard. And right now, the Sudanese armed forces is denying that there's even a famine. Meanwhile, the rest of the world sees very clearly that not only is there a famine, but it's the greatest famine we've seen in 40 years. That kind of bureaucratic impediment, which filters down to every level, is the reason we don't see enough aid in Darfur, because the Sudanese armed forces has been blocking aid for the past 2 years, and very desperately now the people of Darfur are needing that aid. Of course, the RSF have also been blocking aid. In fact, they've been stopping trucks, some of them carrying food for children, from entering Al-Fashir, and there's a huge deficit in the amount of aid that is currently there, not just in Tawila, where many people are leaving to, but also in the border town of Tine in the north. Now, that border town was to some degree under the auspices of the Sudanese armed forces, and right now there needs to be food rushed in very, very urgently to that town of Tine. I don't see that the Sudanese armed forces will move very quickly in trying to get all the permissions, etc., approved in order to get food there. So there are many failures here, and I think let's depoliticize this as much as possible if we're trying to get food to the people that need it, rather than scoring political points.
Right, getting food to where people need it obviously takes funding, and we're seeing this funding shortage, which piles more misery on this living, breathing catastrophe, Justin.
Sure, I think that, Kholood made a great point there about the international funding. And I think that one of the really important things that international donors need to remember is that it is really local Sudanese who are responding to this crisis. It is the local emergency response rooms, and it is these local Sudanese groups themselves who have formed these groups organically to respond to the humanitarian crisis. And so while these UN cuts are really devastating, that the United States has really led from the Trump administration, the real impact in Darfur are the groups that are implementing, right? These are NGOs and these are INGOs that are really the ones who are delivering food. So I think that if there is one thing that the international community needs to focus on, it is that these INGOs and these NGOs and these local, really Sudanese organizations continue to receive support because they are the ones delivering food in these soup kitchens, which you're seeing right now in these photos.
Amgad, to what degree do you think the situation has been made worse by Donald Trump's pulling of USAID?
Actually, the vulgar actions that cuts Trump have made towards the international aid have affected the whole world. But the truth that the funding gap to the humanitarian response to Sudan was there even before Trump comes to power. In 2023, the humanitarian response plan of the UN was only funded by 50%. And so the problem was already there. And I will have to agree with Justin here that the Trump factor, the shock that Trump did was actually needed for the international community to consider more cost-effective interventions by adopting localization and localized response that was not only in Darfur, it was in Khartoum, it was in Jazeera, it's all over Sudan, who actually managed to be innovative and courageous enough to do what's necessarily to be done, what needed to be done when the UN and the other INGO fled the scene.
Kholood, this drop in funding from donor states, it's not just happening in Sudan, it's across the world. So why is this trend underway? Is it just the Trump factor, or what else is coming into play here?
Well, as Amgad just said, for Sudan, it was a perennial issue. Sudan's humanitarian envelope has been consistently underfunded, which was not the case, for example, for Ukraine. So those dynamics have been there. They will continue to be there. Sudan, is a country, African country with, those impacted mostly being Africans, Black people. That doesn't register as highly in Western sort of priorities as it should. But the problem is that for Sudan right now, it is the world's largest humanitarian crisis by many magnitudes, and any cut in funding will have an immediate and devastating effect. But if you sort of look at what's happening in other countries, not just in the United States, we're seeing several countries, the Swiss, the Brits, the Dutch, and others cut their funding as well in order to put more of their national budgets towards defense. Now, humanitarian funding was in the first place not that large to make such a big difference in terms of defense funding, but the cuts in aid, minimal though they were in terms of the larger national budget, were having a big impact in countries receiving aid. So what you have here is a very facile calculation that by cutting aid, you might be able to spend more in defense, but really what it's doing is costing lives. We're seeing this because the world is becoming a lot more transactional in its foreign policy. There's a lot of defense spending because a lot of countries are gearing up to fight wars without the security guarantees that the United States formally provided. And so we are seeing a sea change here. As Justin said earlier, it's not just about, the sector within Sudan, the humanitarian aid sector. It's about a systemic change across the field and across the humanitarian industry. What this means for people in Sudan is that, even if, as Justin rightly said, the lion's share of the humanitarian response is done by local actors, there's still the cuts that we're seeing, particularly from the United States, but also from elsewhere, is going to have detrimental effects for years to come.
Interesting. Justin, how dangerous is it for global security in this area when there seem to be few states willing to fight for crises like this? What kind of impact does it have on global solidarity, especially, as Kholood was just talking about, then when states are spending much, much more on defence with the threat of the escalation of fighting across the world? What's the impact of not investing in funding like this?
I think it's such a critical question that you just asked. If you speak with people in the Pentagon, people in every defense ministry in the Western world, they will say that the money spent on humanitarian aid gives a greater value than money spent across other parts of the government. And that is because prevention is the key to a lot of what we try and do as development actors and as humanitarian actors, right? This is why it is actually quite critical that we look at what happened in the past so we can try and look at ways that we can make better policy decisions in the future. What we're looking at right now is really an age of global indifference led by individuals from Silicon Valley and others who really have no experience in conflict settings, because those who do, those who are actually in the military from the United States, from the UK, from the West, knows how valuable humanitarian aid is for prevention. As Amgad said, this has tremendous waste, right? And we absolutely need to tackle that head on, right? I think that Amgad knows, and as Kholood knows, this is something that, we all worked very hard to do in Sudan. I fought a losing battle to do, right? But we needed to kind of keep tackling this issue and to keep reforming this system instead of completely dismantling it, because now it's the Sudanese who are really feeling the consequences of this.
It is the worst famine since Ethiopia in the 1980s, at the time of Bob Geldof, of course, and Live Aid and all that. Do we need, Amgad, a global response on that scale when the world united?
Of course, the whole crisis in Sudan, whether the political or the humanitarian or the military, needs a unified global approach toward ending this misery. But the problem is that many decision-making centers in the world is under the influence of one side of the world. The UAE have been using its influence to enforce an analysis that strips Sudan and the Sudanese of their sovereignties. And we need to understand, we need to recognize that in Sudan, in Al-Fashir, in Khartoum, in Jazeera, there are people who are fighting for their lives because they king in the areas that they controlled, like Guinea. The Sudanese army is fighting the RSF, but the fact is that the Sudanese people are also fighting the RSF.
Kholood, would you like to respond to what you were hearing from Amgad?
Well, I think, there are certainly proxy elements of this war. We're seeing the United Arab Emirates supporting the RSF. We're seeing the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks supporting the Sudanese armed forces. Increasingly, this is becoming a conflict that is going to be decided, elsewhere. And so, talks of sovereignty seem a bit laughable in that context. But I believe the people of Sudan are sovereign. I don't see, since the coup of 2021, any military actor having any claim to sovereignty, be the Sudanese armed forces and certainly not the rapid support forces. I think we need to focus on what's important here. The people of Sudan have rejected militarism before. They continue to reject militarism now, even as this war is making that an impossible choice. And what people in Sudan want to see is peace. They want to see an ability to have their children go to school, to have good healthcare, to go back to their livelihoods. They don't want a continuation of this war, which is a sentence at the start and increasingly has not found any meaning beyond, the propaganda of one side or the other. This is not, I think, the time, unfortunately, where we're seeing the world come together in solidarity around Sudan, neither, sort of financially speaking in terms of aid, but neither politically either. The only talks that are on the table right now are talks that have failed before, a second Cairo conference and a third Jeddah conference. And what we're seeing in those conferences is the inextricable linking of the humanitarian and protection track with the ceasefire track, which is absolutely not going to get us to any kind of position where we secure a ceasefire, certainly not without a political agreement, but also by linking ceasefire to humanitarian and protection, we're effectively allowing the two main belligerent parties and their associated militias to dictate the terms of aid and to demarcate the lines of protection, which means that people in Al-Fashir will continue to face the kinds of misery that they have been facing at the hands of the RSF for months to come. And the people in central Sudan are not finding any respite or any kind of pushback against these militias, and these continue to mete out violence against them.
Justin, this question of aid and diminishing funding around the world, do you think, we're entering an era where doing the right thing to do, just holds no value anymore?
Potentially in the short term, but history has a very long arc, and there is no question that we are entering a phase of global indifference, right? But I think that in 10 to 15 to 20 years, we will look back at this current era of global indifference and recognize the huge errors that we have made. And Sudan will be the case in point of how the international community's failure to take this crisis seriously has had huge geostrategic consequences, not only for Africa, but for the West. We will be kicking ourselves, we have a stupid policy in the West, right, of exporting this to the UAE, to Turkey, to Iran, to say, this is not a priority for us. We don't really think this is as serious as it is to Emirati investment in AI in Microsoft. We don't think it's as serious as, Turkish membership in NATO. What's happening in Sudan will come back to haunt us for decades to come. And I think that we should hold these Western policymakers accountable for their inaction.
Kholood, I mentioned the Ethiopian famine of the 80s when the world came together. The thing is, the world is a very different place now, isn't it? Have values, do you think, moved elsewhere, or is there just not the bandwidth for crises like this?
No, I think there have always been, several crises of different scales, and the world has always found a way to, manage sympathy for those crises at the same time. I think what we're seeing, and Gaza shows this very well, Palestine in general, is that there is a lot of solidarity and increasing solidarity with, groups that are put upon, particularly civilians. What we're seeing, I think, in the trend that I'm seeing is the increasing disconnect between populations and their governments. And so where you have, increasing solidarity across different polities, across different groups and nations, what you're not seeing is that governments are responding to that sort of solidarity from their people. And that disconnect is actually something that these countries need to be very careful of. That's the trend that is quite worrying. I think on Sudan, it's also a media issue. We don't see Sudan featuring on headlines as much as it should, considering just the magnitude and the scale. The world's largest humanitarian, hunger, displacement and protection crisis all rolled into one. There are so many failures here, as Justin said, that people will be regretting, but we need action now. We cannot afford 15 to 20 years for people to recognize that mistakes were made.
And Justin, you can't stop a famine with food alone, right? You need healthcare, you need water, you need sanitation, you need a lot of things, an awful lot of things to come together.
Absolutely. I think there are two things that the international community should be doing right now. One is, you showed a critical clip at the beginning of what's happening in Tooele. This is where the ball is moving next. And we need to really raise the stakes for both the SAF and the RSF to make sure that there is freedom of movement for those internally displaced from the Zamzam camp and from those in North Darfur, that they can move to Tooele without any fear, and that we need to make sure that there is a massive scale up in the humanitarian response. That is the first thing that the international community needs to do. The second thing is that we really need to get real about international diplomacy. These conferences of the same formula, we know these are not going to work. Whether the war ends in 6 months or in 60 years, it's going to be a conversation between the UAE and the Sudanese armed forces. So we need to have nation states facilitate this conversation between these two sides, or else this war is going to continue.
All right, well, it is a truly troubling, horrifying situation, and we can only hope that somehow, somewhere, something can happen to ease the suffering of millions. We'll leave it there. Thank you to all of our guests. We lost connection with Amgad in the end, but we thank him, Amgad, Fareid, Eltayeb and Kholood, Khair and Justin Lynch. Thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again at any time by visiting our website. aljazeera.com is the address. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.